One of the traps that you see gun banners use is they will talk about the gun homicide rate. The gun homicide rate isn't what matters. It's the homicide rate that matters. If we only talk about the gun homicide rate, that's because you want to talk about guns instead of talking about homicide. What most of us are worried about is homicide, violent crime. That's what we want to worry about. And a great example of this is we could talk about the gun suicide rate. Japan has almost no guns and has a very low gun suicide rate. But Japan's suicide rate is double our suicide rate. So obviously the problem of suicide in Japan is not a gun problem, it's a suicide problem. So what is the homicide problem in the United States? Now it may be a small world, but it's a big country. And it turns out in the United States, the homicide rate is very different in different parts of the country. New Hampshire, Vermont have very low homicide rates compared to the rest of the country. In fact, New Hampshire and Vermont have homicide rates similar to Europe, lower than places like Belgium and Greece, while the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico have astonishingly high homicide rates. Now, you must think, if you believe that guns are the problem, that Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. have loose gun laws and New Hampshire and Vermont have strict gun laws, but it's quite the opposite. New Hampshire and Vermont respect the Second Amendment. There's no assault weapons law. People can carry concealed. Very, very limited, almost no gun laws restricting people in those states, and yet they have low homicide rates, while Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia have high homicide rates. So the homicide problem in the United States is not a problem related to guns. Certainly guns are involved in many of the homicides, but that's not the problem. The problem is that different parts of the country have different homicide rates, and that's what we should be talking about. Why are there so many murders in Puerto Rico? Why are there so many murders in Washington, D.C.? Why are there so many murders in Chicago? These are questions we should be asking. And why aren't there? Why don't we see the same problems in New Hampshire and Vermont and Iowa and Hawaii and Minnesota and Utah? What are the differences between these places? That would be a meaningful conversation. But if you only talk about the gun homicide rate, you're focusing on guns deliberately and you're avoiding the homicide problem.